The rain was coming down in torrents, the kind of storm that made the world feel smaller, shrouded in darkness and water. My windshield wipers struggled against the downpour as I navigated a winding two-lane road deep in the backcountry of West Virginia. It was the long way home, but I preferred the solitude, until that night. I had just finished a long shift at the plant, my body aching, mind foggy. The coffee in my thermos had gone lukewarm hours ago, and my phone's GPS kept cutting out. But I knew these roads well enough to manage without it. It wasn't my first late-night drive through a storm like this. I'd been listening to the radio, mostly static with the occasional burst of some old rock station, when I saw it. A flash of red up ahead, just barely visible through the sheets of rain. At first, I thought it was a taillight, maybe someone pulled over. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't a car. It was something much smaller. A red umbrella, open and tilted at an odd angle, lying in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, the tires skidding on the slick pavement. My heart pounded as the car came to a halt, the umbrella illuminated by my headlights. It shouldn't have been there, this road was deserted for miles in every direction. I waited a moment, expecting someone to come running out of the dark to claim it. But no one did. The rain hammered against the roof of my car, drowning out any other sound. Finally, I sighed, grabbed my flashlight from the glove box, and stepped out into the storm. The cold hit me like a slap. Within seconds, I was soaked to the bone, the rain relentless. I approached the umbrella cautiously, shining the flashlight around the road and into the surrounding woods. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely carrying over the storm. "Anyone out there?" No answer. The umbrella was pristine, no tears, no dirt, like someone had just set it down and walked away. I picked it up, folding it closed, and looked around again. Something about the scene made my skin crawl, but I couldn't put my finger on it. As I turned back toward my car, that's when I saw the footprints. They were faint, just impressions in the wet road, leading away from where the umbrella had been. They disappeared into the woods, swallowed by the mud and undergrowth. The prints looked fresh, too fresh. Whoever left them had been there recently. I hesitated, the flashlight beam trembling slightly in my hand. "Hey!" I shouted, louder this time. "If you're out here, you need to get inside. It's not safe in this weather." Still no response. Just rain and the distant rumble of thunder. I didn't want to follow those tracks, but something about them gnawed at me. What if someone was hurt? What if they'd gotten caught in the storm and wandered off, disoriented? My gut told me to get back in the car and leave, but my conscience wouldn't let me. Against my better judgment, I stepped off the road and into the woods. The ground was a mess of mud and tangled roots, every step a struggle. The flashlight's beam barely cut through the darkness, and the rain made it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. The trees were dense, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. Every so often, I'd stop and listen, hoping to hear something, anything, but there was only the rain. I followed the footprints as best as I could, but they kept fading in and out, the mud swallowing them up. After a few minutes, I realized I was completely off the path. The road was gone, and the woods seemed to stretch on forever. That's when I heard it. A faint rustling, just ahead. My heart jumped into my throat. I raised the flashlight, its beam catching on something red in the distance. For a moment, I thought it was another umbrella, but as I got closer, I saw it was a jacket. A bright red raincoat hanging from a low branch. It didn't make any sense. There were no other signs of anyone, no footprints, no belongings, nothing. Just the jacket, swaying gently in the wind. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, but I couldn't. It was like something was pulling me forward, deeper into the woods. I reached out to touch the jacket, and the moment my fingers brushed the fabric, the sound of the rustling came again, this time, much closer. "Who's there?" I demanded, spinning around, the flashlight darting through the trees. Nothing. Just shadows and rain. And then I felt it, a hand on my shoulder. I whirled around, but no one was there. The flashlight slipped from my grip, landing in the mud with a dull thud. I scrambled to pick it up, my heart hammering in my chest. The beam flickered, the light weak and sputtering. That's when I saw the figure. It was standing just beyond the edge of the flashlight's reach, barely visible. A tall, thin shape, motionless and silent. Its head tilted slightly to one side, as though it were studying me. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't see its face, if it even had one, but I could feel its gaze, cold and unrelenting. I stumbled back, nearly slipping in the mud. "Stay back!" I shouted, though my voice cracked. "I'm warning you." The figure didn't move. For a moment, I thought maybe it wasn't real, just a trick of the light or my own panicked mind. But then it started walking toward me. Not running, walking. Slow, deliberate steps. I turned and ran. Branches whipped at my face as I tore through the woods, the flashlight bouncing in my hand. I could hear the sound of footsteps behind me, steady and unhurried, no matter how fast I went. The rain was blinding, and I slipped twice, barely managing to keep my footing. Finally, I saw the faint glow of my car's headlights through the trees. Relief flooded through me as I burst onto the road, nearly collapsing as I reached the car door. I threw myself inside, slamming the door shut and locking it. For a moment, I just sat there, gasping for breath, the rain pounding against the windows. The headlights illuminated the empty road ahead. No sign of anyone, or anything. But when I looked into the rearview mirror, my blood ran cold. There, in the red glow of the taillights, was the umbrella. I stared at the umbrella in the taillights, my pulse thundering in my ears. I hadn't left it there, it had been in my hand when I walked into the woods. Yet there it was, neatly unfolded, and lying in the exact spot where I'd first seen it. A chill crawled up my spine, and I gripped the steering wheel tightly, trying to steady my shaking hands. My instincts screamed at me to drive, to get out of there as fast as I could. But part of me, some stubborn, irrational part, wanted an explanation. I leaned forward, squinting into the rain-soaked rearview mirror. There was nothing else there. No figure, no footprints, just the umbrella. I turned off the engine, the world plunging into eerie silence save for the rain hammering against the car. My headlights dimmed but still cast enough light to see the road. Slowly, I reached for the flashlight again, its beam flickering weakly as I stepped out of the car. The cold hit me like a wave, the rain instantly soaking my clothes. The umbrella sat there, its crimson fabric glowing under the dim red taillight. As I approached, my heart pounded so hard it felt like it might burst. The rain muffled every other sound, turning the world into a suffocating void of water and darkness. I reached out, hesitating for a moment before grabbing the umbrella's handle. The fabric was slick and cold, almost unnaturally so. I folded it shut, my hands trembling, and then froze. Footsteps. Not mine. Not the steady thud of rain hitting the pavement. Actual footsteps, soft and deliberate, coming from somewhere behind me. I spun around, the flashlight beam cutting through the rain. At first, I saw nothing but trees and the shimmering mist of water. But then I spotted it, a shape, just barely visible in the shadows beyond the road. It was standing still, the same way it had in the woods, its head cocked at that unnatural angle. "Stay back!" I shouted, my voice trembling. "I don't know what you want, but I'm leaving. Don't follow me." The figure didn't respond, didn't even flinch. It just stood there, its outline barely distinguishable from the surrounding darkness. The rain made it almost impossible to see clearly, but I could swear its head tilted a little further, as if curious. Then it moved. Not toward me, at least, not directly. It walked slowly across the road, disappearing into the trees on the other side. The movement was fluid but wrong, like a puppet on invisible strings. I backed up until I hit the car, fumbling for the door handle. I climbed in and locked the doors, throwing the umbrella onto the passenger seat. My fingers fumbled to start the car, and the engine roared to life. The headlights cut through the rain again, illuminating the empty road ahead. For a moment, I just sat there, gripping the wheel, trying to catch my breath. That's when the radio turned on. I hadn't touched it, hadn't even thought about it, but the static crackled through the speakers, loud and jarring. I reached for the dial to turn it off, but before I could, the static shifted. A voice broke through, faint and distorted, like it was coming from miles away. "You shouldn't have stopped." I froze, staring at the radio. The voice was calm, almost monotonous, but it sent a jolt of fear through me. I turned the dial, but it didn't change. The voice came again, clearer this time. "You should have kept driving." I slammed my hand against the power button, and the radio cut off. The silence was deafening, broken only by the rain pounding against the car. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the wheel. I didn't care what was out there anymore, I just wanted to get away. I threw the car into gear and sped down the road, the tires slipping on the wet pavement. The trees blurred past, their dark shapes stretching endlessly on either side. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure chasing me. But the road was empty. For a while, it seemed like I was in the clear. The umbrella still sat in the passenger seat, mocking me, but nothing else happened. The road stretched on, and the rain showed no signs of letting up. My heart began to slow, and I told myself it was over. Whatever had happened back there, it was behind me now. Then I saw the headlights. They appeared out of nowhere, bright and blinding, coming up fast in the opposite lane. At first, I thought it was just another car, maybe someone else caught in the storm. But as it got closer, I realized something was wrong. The lights were moving too fast, swerving erratically, as if the driver had lost control. "Jesus," I muttered, gripping the wheel tightly. The car didn't slow as it barreled toward me, its high beams reflecting off the rain-soaked road. At the last second, I swerved to the right, my tires skidding as the other car shot past. I barely caught a glimpse of it, a black sedan, its windows completely darkened. There was no driver. I came to a stop on the side of the road, my heart hammering in my chest. The other car's headlights disappeared into the distance, swallowed by the storm. I waited for a moment, trying to catch my breath, but then I noticed something. The umbrella was gone. The passenger seat was empty, completely dry, as if it had never been there. I looked around frantically, my mind racing. Had it fallen? No, it had been sitting upright, wedged against the seat. It couldn't have moved on its own. A tapping sound broke through my thoughts. At first, I thought it was just the rain, but it was too rhythmic. Too deliberate. I turned slowly, my breath hitching in my throat. The figure was outside my car window, its face inches from the glass. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Its head was tilted, just like before, and though its features were shrouded in shadow, I could feel its eyes on me. The tapping continued, soft and methodical, as if it were waiting for something. I slammed my foot on the gas, the car lurching forward. The figure vanished as the wheels spun, kicking up water and mud. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just drove, the rain blurring everything around me. When I finally made it home, the storm had let up, but the unease remained. My clothes were still damp, my skin cold, but I didn't care. I locked every door, closed every window, and sat in the corner of my living room, shaking. I haven't driven that road since. It had been raining for 3 days straight, the kind of unrelenting storm that turns dirt roads into swamps and ditches into rivers. I just wrapped up a late dinner at a diner off the interstate, one of those places with faded booths and a jukebox that hadn't worked in decades. The waitress, an older lady with tired eyes, had joked about how the storm seemed like it'd never end. "Be careful out there, she said as I paid my bill. Nights like these, the roads get tricky. I gave her a polite nod and stepped outside, the rain instantly soaking my jacket. The parking lot was nearly empty, just my old truck and a beat-up sedan with a missing hubcap. The rain hammered the roof of the truck as I climbed in, the sound a constant drumbeat against the quiet of the cab. The plan was simple: get home, dry off, and collapse into bed. The road leading to my place wound through a heavily wooded area, and in weather like this, it felt even more isolated. But I didn't mind. I liked the solitude. Or at least, I thought I did. About 10 minutes into the drive, the rain started coming down even harder, and my wipers could barely keep up. The narrow road was pitch black except for the faint glow of my headlights reflecting off the rain-slick pavement. I slowed down, gripping the wheel tightly, trying to focus. That's when I saw the detour sign. It was one of those temporary ones, slapped together with sandbags and a reflective arrow pointing to the left. I cursed under my breath. The main road must have flooded, which wasn't uncommon out here. The detour led me onto a gravel path that I didn't recognize, winding deeper into the woods. My GPS had no signal, and the rain distorted everything, making it hard to tell how far I'd gone or where I was heading. The first sign of trouble came when my headlights caught the edge of a pond. It appeared suddenly, right alongside the road, its surface shimmering under the rain. I hadn't noticed it before, but it wasn't unusual for this area. The weird part was the figure standing at the edge of the water. At first, I thought it was a tree. It was tall and thin, its silhouette almost blending into the rain-soaked landscape. But as I got closer, I realized it was a man. He was just standing there, staring out at the water. He didn't have an umbrella or a raincoat, just a dark suit that clung to his body like it had been painted on. I slowed the truck, my curiosity outweighing my better judgment. My headlights illuminated him briefly, and in that flash, I saw his face. He was pale, his eyes sunken, and his mouth was slightly open like he was whispering to himself. I rolled down the window slightly, the rain immediately splattering onto the seat. "Hey, you okay out there?" I called, my voice barely carrying over the storm. He didn't respond. Didn't even turn around. I hesitated. Something about him felt wrong, but I couldn't just leave him there. What if he was hurt? Or lost? I pulled the truck onto the shoulder, grabbed my flashlight and stepped out into the rain. The cold was biting, and the ground was already turning to mud under my boots. "Sir." I called out, shining the flashlight toward him. He still didn't move. I got closer, the beam of light cutting through the rain and landing on his back. His suit was soaked, the fabric clinging to his skin, but he seemed completely unaffected by the cold or the rain. When I was just a few feet away, he finally moved. Slowly, he turned his head toward me, and I swear I felt the temperature drop. His face was wrong. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and his skin was so pale it almost seemed translucent. But it was his mouth that froze me in place. It was stretched into a grin, too wide to be natural, the corners of his lips curling up almost to his ears. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. "Are you hurt?" I stammered, though I already knew I didn't want the answer. His grin widened, impossibly so, and then he spoke. But his voice didn't sound like it was coming from his mouth. It was distant, echoing, like a recording played underwater. "You shouldn't have stopped." My stomach dropped. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. He tilted his head, his grin still plastered across his face, and took a single step toward me. That broke the spell. I turned and bolted back to the truck, the mud sucking at my boots with every step. Behind me, I could hear splashing, like something was crawling out of the pond, something heavy and wet. I didn't dare look back. I threw myself into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut and locking it. My hands fumbled with the keys, the engine sputtering to life just as a loud thud hit the back of the truck. The whole vehicle shook, and I screamed, slamming my foot on the gas. The tires spun in the mud before finally catching, and the truck lurched forward, fishtailing slightly as I tore down the gravel road. In the rearview mirror, I saw him standing in the middle of the road, the rain pouring down around him. He wasn't running, wasn't even moving. Just standing there, watching me. His grin seemed to glow in the darkness, a horrifying beacon that stayed with me long after I lost sight of him. I didn't stop driving until I saw the faint lights of a gas station up ahead. The storm was still raging, but the sight of civilization was enough to steady my nerves. I pulled into the parking lot, breathing hard, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. I sat there for a moment, trying to convince myself it was over, that I was safe. But then I saw it. A wet handprint, smeared across the passenger window. It was too large to be mine. The handprint on the window was unmistakable, long, spindly fingers and an almost claw-like shape, pressed into the fogged glass as if it had been watching me the whole time. My breath caught, and for a moment, I couldn't move. The truck's engine hummed softly, the rain still hammering on the roof like an unrelenting drumbeat. I told myself to stay calm. Maybe I was just seeing things, my mind playing tricks on me after that encounter. I grabbed a rag from the console, leaned over, and wiped the glass clean. But the moment I sat back, the hairs on my neck stood up. The handprint reappeared. This time, it was on the windshield, smeared right in front of me. I froze, my stomach twisting into knots. The print was wet, fresh, like someone, or something, had just pressed their hand there. I glanced around the parking lot, half expecting to see him again, standing there in the rain. But the gas station was empty, the flickering neon sign casting an eerie glow over the puddles. I fumbled with the door handle, stepping out into the storm. The rain drenched me instantly, but I didn't care. I needed to check the truck, to convince myself there was no one hiding in the back seat, no one crouched behind the cab. I circled the vehicle, flashlight in hand, the beam cutting through the rain and bouncing off the wet metal. The truck bed was empty, and the doors were locked. But when I reached the rear of the truck, I stopped cold. The tailgate was covered in muddy handprints. Dozens of them. They were smeared and overlapping, as though someone had been crawling all over the back of the truck. My flashlight trembled in my hand as I backed away, my boots splashing in the growing puddles. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural sound, almost like a growl, coming from the woods behind the gas station. I whipped the flashlight toward the noise, the beam illuminating the edge of the tree line. For a moment, I thought I saw something move, something tall and hunched, its limbs unnaturally long. But it disappeared before I could get a good look. The growling stopped, replaced by an unnatural silence. No rain, no wind, no hum of the gas station's lights. Just silence. My heart pounded in my ears as I stood there, frozen, my flashlight flickering weakly. Then I felt it. A hand, cold and wet, resting on my shoulder. I spun around, the flashlight slipping from my grip and hitting the ground with a splash. No one was there. Just the rain, the truck, and the empty parking lot. My breathing was ragged, my chest tight, and I realized I had to get out of there. Now. I scrambled back into the truck, locking the doors and throwing it into gear. The tires skidded on the slick pavement as I tore out of the parking lot, the gas station disappearing behind me. The road was a blur of rain and darkness, but I didn't care. I just needed to put as much distance as possible between me and that place. For a while, nothing happened. The road stretched endlessly ahead, winding through the forest like a snake. The rain continued its relentless assault, and I focused on keeping the truck steady on the slick surface. My grip on the wheel was so tight it hurt, but I didn't dare relax. Then the radio came on. I hadn't touched it. The knob hadn't been turned, and my hands were firmly on the wheel. But the static crackled through the speakers, loud and jarring, making me jump. I reached out to turn it off, but before I could, the static shifted. A voice emerged, faint and distorted, like it was coming from a great distance. "You left the road." I froze. My eyes darted to the GPS, but the screen was blank, just a dark, lifeless rectangle. The voice came again, louder this time, cutting through the static. "You shouldn't have left." My stomach churned, and I slammed my hand against the radio, trying to shut it off. The voice didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent, layering over itself until it sounded like a dozen voices speaking at once. "Turn back. Turn back. Turn back." I hit the brakes, the truck skidding to a halt in the middle of the road. The radio cut off abruptly, plunging the cab into silence. My headlights illuminated the rain-soaked pavement, and for a moment, I just sat there, gripping the wheel, my heart hammering in my chest. And then I saw him. The man from the pond, standing just beyond the reach of my headlights. His suit clung to his body, his grin as wide and unnatural as before. He raised one long, thin hand and pointed behind me, back toward the gas station. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and my blood turned to ice. There was something in the truck bed. A shape, hunched and dripping, its fingers clawing at the edges of the tailgate. Its face was hidden in shadow, but I could see its chest heaving, its breath fogging the glass of the rear window. I didn't think. I slammed on the gas, the truck lurching forward as I swerved around the figure in the road. The thing in the bed slammed against the rear window, but I didn't look back. My only thought was to get away, to put as much distance as possible between me and whatever was out there. The rain blurred everything, but I didn't care. I kept driving, my knuckles white on the wheel, until I saw the faint glow of streetlights ahead. Civilization. Safety. When I finally pulled into my driveway, the storm had lessened to a drizzle. I sat in the truck for a long time, staring at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that thing still in the bed. But it was empty. No handprints, no mud, no sign that anything had been there at all. I stepped out, the rain cool against my skin, and looked around. The night was still, almost peaceful. But as I turned toward my front door, something caught my eye. A wet, red umbrella, propped neatly against the porch railing. I didn't sleep that night. It started as a simple trip back home, one I'd made 100 times before. The storm had rolled in faster than I expected, heavy drops pelting my windshield as I pulled out of my friend Mike's driveway. It was just after 9 p.m., and the rain made the familiar streets feel like a maze of glistening black mirrors. My truck's wipers strained against the downpour, barely keeping the road visible. Mike had warned me before I left. "Don't take the back roads tonight," he said, leaning against the doorway with a beer in hand. "This storm's bad. Roads flood fast out there, especially near those old logging trails." But I didn't listen. I never did when it came to shortcuts. The back roads were faster, quieter. Besides, I'd driven them a dozen times, even in worse weather than this. I figured I'd be fine. The first few miles weren't bad, just slow. The rain was relentless, but the truck handled the puddles well enough. The trees lining the road looked eerie in the headlights, their wet branches clawing at the sky. I turned on the radio to drown out the drumming rain, but all I got was static. Typical for this area, too remote for a decent signal. I took a left onto a narrow dirt road, the real shortcut. It was more of a path than a road, really, but it cut through the woods and would shave 10 minutes off the trip. The truck's headlights bounced as the tires hit deep ruts, and the rain seemed to intensify, slashing across the windshield in horizontal waves. About halfway down the road, the mud started to take over. The tires slipped and skidded, forcing me to slow to a crawl. I cursed under my breath, gripping the wheel tighter. The trees seemed closer here, almost leaning over the road like they were trying to block my way. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just a flicker of light up ahead. A pale, flickering glow that seemed out of place in the middle of nowhere. My first thought was that someone had broken down, maybe trying to signal for help. I slowed the truck, squinting through the rain as the light grew brighter. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't a car or even a flashlight. It was a lantern. A woman was standing in the middle of the road, holding the lantern up high. Her clothes were soaked, and her hair clung to her face. She didn't move as I approached, didn't wave or signal for me to stop. She just stood there, her head tilted slightly, staring at my truck. I rolled down the window a crack, the rain immediately splattering inside. "Ma'am, do you need help?" I called out, my voice barely carrying over the storm. She didn't respond. The lantern swayed slightly in her hand, the light flickering, but she didn't so much as blink. I inched the truck forward, unsure of what to do. The road was too narrow to turn around, and she was blocking the only way forward. I honked the horn, a short, sharp burst. "Hey! Are you okay?" Still nothing. Just that eerie, unmoving stare. I was about to get out of the truck when she finally moved. Without a word, she turned and walked off the road, disappearing into the woods. The lantern's light bobbed through the trees for a moment before vanishing entirely. I sat there for a moment, my heart pounding. Something about the whole thing felt wrong. Why would anyone be out here, in the middle of nowhere, in this weather? And why hadn't she said anything? I shook my head, trying to shake the unease. Probably just someone who lived nearby, I told myself. Maybe she was checking on something or heading to a neighbor's house. Either way, it wasn't my business. I pressed the gas and continued down the road, my eyes darting to the tree line every few seconds. The rain was relentless, and the road grew worse with every mile. Deep puddles formed in the ruts, and the mud was so thick the tires struggled to push through. My nerves were on edge, the woman's blank stare still fresh in my mind. About 10 minutes later, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The lantern. It was ahead of me again, glowing faintly through the rain. She was back, standing in the road just as before, the exact same pose. It was impossible, there was no way she could have gotten ahead of me. I hadn't passed any turnoffs, no paths or trails where she could have cut through. I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding slightly before coming to a stop. My hands gripped the wheel so tightly they ached. "What the hell?" I muttered. This time, I didn't bother calling out. I threw the truck in reverse, the tires slipping as I backed up. The lantern didn't move, but the woman tilted her head again, her face partially obscured by the rain. The truck slid in the mud, the tires spinning uselessly, and I cursed, shifting back into drive. When I looked up again, she was gone. I stared at the empty road ahead, my heart racing. The rain hammered against the roof, drowning out every other sound. I leaned forward, scanning the tree line with the high beams, but there was no sign of her. No lantern. No footprints. Nothing. I wanted to turn around, but the narrow road and worsening conditions made it impossible. I had no choice but to keep going. The unease in my chest grew with every mile, the storm wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. And then it happened. The truck's engine sputtered and died, the headlights flickering out, leaving me in total darkness. The rain seemed louder now, almost deafening. I tried the ignition, but the engine wouldn't turn over. The battery was dead. That's when I heard it, a soft tapping on the window. I didn't want to look. But I had to. When I turned, the woman was there, her face inches from the glass, the lantern glowing faintly in her hand. Her lips curled into a slow, unnatural smile, and she whispered one word. "Run." The word echoed in my mind, louder than the rain pounding on the truck. I couldn't move, couldn't even breathe, as her face pressed closer to the window. Her pale skin seemed to glow in the faint light of the lantern, and her smile widened into something unnatural, grotesque. Then she tapped the glass again, sharp, deliberate. "Run," she repeated, her voice a soft whisper that somehow cut through the storm. That was all it took. Adrenaline kicked in, and I shoved the door open, bolting out into the rain without even thinking. The mud sucked at my boots as I sprinted away from the truck, the cold rain soaking me to the bone. The wind howled through the trees, and I could barely see a few feet ahead, but I didn't stop. Behind me, I heard something. It wasn't the soft squelch of my own footsteps or the relentless drumming of the rain. It was heavier, deliberate, a second set of steps, chasing me. I risked a glance over my shoulder, and there she was. The lantern bobbed in her hand, the flame flickering, but she wasn't walking. She was running, no, sprinting, her feet moving unnaturally fast, her arms hanging limply at her sides as if she wasn't using them at all. Her grin was still plastered across her face, wide and chilling, her eyes locked on me. I tripped, my body slamming into the mud. The cold, wet ground knocked the wind out of me, but I scrambled to my feet, gasping. She was closer now, no more than 20 feet away, her bare feet splashing through the puddles. I turned and ran, my lungs burning, my heart pounding in my ears. The trees loomed on either side of the road, their branches clawing at me as I veered off the path. I didn't know where I was going, just that I had to get away. The woods were a maze of shadows and rain, the ground uneven and treacherous. I stumbled again, barely catching myself on a tree trunk. The sound of her footsteps stopped. I froze, pressing myself against the tree, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The rain poured down, masking every other sound. I strained my ears, listening for any sign of her, but there was nothing. Then I saw the lantern. It appeared in the distance, a faint, flickering light weaving between the trees. She wasn't holding it anymore, it floated on its own, bobbing closer and closer. My stomach churned as I realized the light wasn't moving randomly. It was searching, scanning the woods like a predator looking for prey. I ducked low, crawling through the mud, trying to stay out of its sight. My hands were trembling, my body shivering from the cold. I didn't dare look back, didn't dare make a sound. The lantern's glow grew brighter, the shadows around me stretching and warping. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the light vanished. The woods plunged into darkness again, the rain the only sound. I stayed crouched for what felt like an eternity, my muscles aching, my clothes soaked through. Finally, I dared to move, inching my way back toward the road. I didn't know if she was still out there, but I couldn't stay in the woods forever. I needed to get to the truck, or at least back to somewhere familiar. The road was slick and empty when I finally stumbled out of the trees. My truck was still there, sitting in the middle of the path, its headlights dim and lifeless. I hesitated, scanning the area for any sign of her. The rain had let up slightly, but the air was heavy, oppressive. I crept toward the truck, my heart hammering in my chest. Every shadow looked like her, every gust of wind sounded like her footsteps. When I finally reached the door, I yanked it open and climbed inside, locking it behind me. The keys were still in the ignition. I turned them, praying the engine would start. At first, there was nothing but a weak sputter. Then, miraculously, the engine roared to life. Relief washed over me, and I slammed the gear shift into drive. That's when I saw her. She was standing in the middle of the road ahead, the lantern back in her hand. Her face was blank now, the grin gone, but her eyes were hollow, dark voids that seemed to pull the light from the world around them. She raised the lantern slowly, holding it out toward me. I hit the gas. The truck lurched forward, the tires spinning in the mud before finding traction. She didn't move, didn't flinch, as the truck barreled toward her. I braced myself, gripping the wheel tightly as I closed the distance. But just before I hit her, the lantern went out. The road was empty. She was gone. I didn't stop, didn't even slow down. I drove like a madman, the tires skidding on the rain-slick road, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. It wasn't until I saw the glow of a gas station in the distance that I allowed myself to breathe. I pulled into the lot, my hands still shaking, and parked under the bright fluorescent lights. The rain was lighter now, almost a drizzle, but I didn't dare get out of the truck. I sat there for a long time, staring at the empty road behind me, half expecting her to appear again. Eventually, I convinced myself it was over. Whatever had happened, it was behind me now. I started the truck again, my nerves still raw, and pulled out of the gas station, determined to make it home. But as I turned onto the main road, I glanced at the passenger seat. There, soaked and glistening, was the lantern.